The letter arrived on a Tuesday. $18,000. 30 days to pay in full, or the county would auction off Vernon Slade's home. He was 82 years old, Navy veteran, 31 years teaching woodworking to teenagers who are now grandfathers themselves. He'd tried to make a partial payment 2 months ago, $6,000. They sent it back, said it was all or nothing. Vernon set the letter down on his kitchen table next to a stack of mail he'd been avoiding for weeks. He didn't know that 3 of his neighbors had received the same letter. Didn't know that a retired accountant at his church had been waiting for someone to say something. Didn't know that the company trying to take his home had made a $400,000 mistake. Vernon Slade finished sanding the roof of the birdhouse and held it up to the light coming through his garage window. Red cedar, sloped roof so the rain runs off, hole drilled exactly 1.5 inches wide, perfect for wrens. He built over 200 of these in the 15 years since he retired. Never charged a penny. Never kept count either, until his wife started writing the number on a notepad she kept by the phone. She stopped updating it when she got sick. The notepad was still there. He set the birdhouse on his workbench next to 3 others waiting for delivery. This one was for the little girl on Maple Court. Her grandmother had mentioned she'd been asking about birds. Vernon didn't know the girl's name, but that didn't matter. He'd walk it over this afternoon and let the grandmother handle introductions. The garage smelled like sawdust and polyurethane. It was the only room in the house that still felt like his. The kitchen had been Doris's territory for 46 years. The living room still had her reading chair angled toward the window, but the garage was where Vernon could breathe, where his hands stayed busy and his mind stayed quiet. He wiped the sawdust off the workbench and headed inside. The kitchen counter had a stack of mail on it that had been growing for 3 weeks. He walked past it the same way he'd been walking past it since the first envelope from Ridgeline Property Services arrived. He knew what was in there. More fees, more threats, more numbers that didn't make sense. Vernon poured himself a cup of coffee and sat down at the table. 82 years old, Navy veteran, 31 years teaching shop class at Pinewood High School. He'd taught teenagers how to measure twice and cut once, how to build something with their hands that would last longer than they would. Now he couldn't figure out how to pay a bill. The cancer had started in his prostate and spread before the doctors caught it. 6 months of treatment that burned through his savings faster than the radiation burned through the tumor. He was in remission now. That was the good news. The bad news was the medical bills had wiped out everything he'd put aside. The worst news was that somewhere in those 6 months, he'd missed a few HOA payments. Then a few more. Then the letters started coming from a company he'd never heard of. Ridgeline Property Services had taken over management of Pinewood Glen 18 months ago. Vernon didn't go to the HOA meeting where they announced it. The neighborhood ran fine without him. He didn't see the point in sitting through 2 hours of arguments about fence heights and garbage can placement. He saw the point now. The mail sat on the counter. Vernon looked at it for a long moment. Then he looked away, toward the window, toward the spot in the backyard where he'd spread Doris's ashes under the dogwood tree she'd planted when they first moved in. 24 years in this house. 24 years of holidays and anniversaries and quiet Sunday mornings. Tomorrow was Sunday. Men's breakfast at the church. He'd go, same as always, sit with Clement and the others, eat powdered eggs and drink weak coffee and talk about nothing at all. He wouldn't mention the letters, wouldn't mention that he'd already tried to fix this, that he'd scraped together $6,000 and sent it to them 2 months ago, that they'd mailed the check back with a form letter saying they don't accept partial payments. Vernon had spent 15 years building birdhouses because it felt good to give people something they didn't ask for. Never expected anything back, never kept a ledger of favors owed. But sitting in his kitchen, looking at that stack of envelopes, Vernon Slade felt something he hadn't felt since the doctors first said the word cancer. He felt alone. The doorbell rang at 9:14 on a Tuesday morning. Vernon was in the kitchen, rinsing his coffee mug, not expecting anyone. He dried his hands on a dish towel and walked to the front door. A young man stood on the porch, mid-20s, polo shirt, clipboard in one hand, manila envelope in the other. He didn't smile. "Vernon Slade? That's me." The young man held out the envelope. "You've been served." Vernon took it. The young man was already walking back to his car before Vernon could ask what it was. Not that he needed to ask. He knew. He'd known for weeks that something like this was coming. He just didn't know it would feel like this. He closed the door and carried the envelope to the kitchen table, sat down in the same chair where he'd eaten breakfast with Doris for 24 years, opened the envelope and pulled out the papers inside. The word at the top of the first page was for AISARECOR, $18,000. That was the amount they claimed he owed. Unpaid assessments, late fees, administrative costs, legal fees, and interest. He had 30 days to pay the full amount. If he didn't, the county would auction his home to the highest bidder. Vernon read the number again, then again. It didn't change. His HOA dues were $300 a month. He'd missed maybe 8 or 9 payments during the worst of the cancer treatment. That was $2,700. Where did the other $15,000 come from? He flipped through the pages. Late fees of $50 per month. Administrative fees of $75 per notice. Legal fees for every letter their attorney sent. Interest compounding monthly. The numbers stacked on top of each other like bricks, building a wall he couldn't see over. Vernon set the papers down. His hands were shaking. Not a lot, just enough that he noticed. He thought about calling his son David in San Antonio. David was a good kid. 54 years old now, but still a good kid. He'd want to help. But David had his own family, his own mortgage, his own problems. Vernon hadn't asked his son for money in his entire adult life. He wasn't going to start now. He thought about the $6,000 he'd sent 2 months ago. Every dollar he could scrape together. He'd written a letter explaining his situation. The cancer, the medical bills, his wife's death. He'd asked if they could work out a payment plan. They sent the check back with a form letter, 1 paragraph, no signature. Just a statement that Ridgeline Property Services does not accept partial payments on accounts referred to legal collection. Full payment required within 30 days of notice. No exceptions. Vernon looked around the kitchen, at the window above the sink, where Doris used to watch the birds in the backyard, at the doorway to the living room where her reading chair still sat by the window. 24 years. This was the house where he'd carried her over the threshold when they moved in, where she'd held his hand through chemo and he'd held hers through hospice. They wanted to take it for $18,000. Sunday was 4 days away. Men's breakfast at the church? He could go, pretend nothing was wrong. That's what he'd been doing for months. But sitting alone with the foreclosure notice on his counter, Vernon made a decision. He would go to breakfast on Sunday, and maybe, if he could find the words, he would tell them the truth. He didn't know yet that it would be the best decision he ever made. Vernon almost didn't go. He woke up Sunday morning with a weight on his chest that had nothing to do with his heart, just dread. The thought of sitting across from Clement and the others pretending everything was fine made him want to crawl back into bed. But he went. 43 years of showing up to things he didn't feel like showing up to. Navy taught him that. Teaching taught him that. You show up, even when it hurts, especially when it hurts. The men's breakfast met in the fellowship hall of Grace Lutheran Church every Sunday at 7:30. Same group for the past 9 years. Clement Howe, 70, retired accountant. Ray Dobbs, 78, retired postal worker. Eugene Stafford, 81, retired electrician. Vernon got there at 7:35. The others were already seated at their usual table. He grabbed a plate, scooped some eggs onto it, poured a cup of coffee, and sat down. Clement was watching him. Vernon could feel it. Clement had been an accountant for 40 years at a manufacturing firm in Louisville before he retired. He had a way of looking at people like he was reading a balance sheet, noticing what didn't add up. The conversation shifted from weather to somebody's knee surgery to the price of gas. Vernon finished his eggs and stared at his coffee. Vernon. Clement was leaning forward, elbows on the table. Something's wrong. It wasn't a question. Vernon thought about lying, thought about finishing his coffee and heading home and figuring this out on his own, the way he'd figured out everything else in his life. But he was so tired of carrying it alone. Got a foreclosure notice, Vernon said. His voice came out quieter than he expected. Tuesday. They want $18,000 in 30 days, or they're taking my house. The table went silent. Ray set down his fork. 18,000? Clement's eyebrows went up. For what? HOA fees, late fees, legal fees, interest. Vernon shook his head. I missed some payments when I was doing chemo, maybe 8 or 9 months. That's $2,700. I don't know where the rest came from. Ridgeline Property Services? Vernon looked at Clement. How'd you know? Because I got the same letter 3 weeks ago. $12,000. Same story. Missed a few payments when my wife was in the hospital. Sent them a partial payment. They sent it back. Vernon's hands went still on his coffee cup. Ray Dobbs spoke up. Same thing happened to me. 14,000. They're saying I owe fees for violations I never got notice about. Eugene Stafford cleared his throat. 16,000. They filed a lien on my house in November. Didn't tell me until January. Vernon looked around the table. 3 men he'd known for years. 3 men he'd sat with every Sunday, talking about nothing important. 3 men hiding the same secret he'd been hiding. They're targeting us, Ray said. Old folks. Fixed incomes. People who don't have lawyers on speed dial. Clement reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small notebook. I've been looking at my statements. The numbers don't add up. Fees for services I never received. Charges that aren't in the CC&Rs. I think there's something wrong with how they're billing the whole neighborhood. You think they're stealing? I think they're overcharging, which is the same thing in a nicer suit. Clement tapped his notebook. I want to look at everyone's statements, compare them, see if there's a pattern. Vernon felt something shift. Not the weightlifting exactly, but something underneath it. Something that felt like the opposite of a loan. Bring your papers to my house next Saturday, Clement said. All of you. And ask around, quietly. See if anyone else in the neighborhood is dealing with the same thing. Vernon walked out of the church an hour later with the first real hope he'd felt in months. 4 men, 4 foreclosure notices, and 1 retired accountant who knew how to read a balance sheet. It wasn't much, but it was a start. By 10 o'clock Saturday morning, there were 17 people in Clement's living room. Vernon recognized most of them. Betty Waller from Birch Street, 74, a retired school secretary. Henry Yates, 83, a Korean War veteran who walked with a cane and rarely left his house. Others, Vernon knew by face but not by name. All of them elderly. All of them carrying folders full of HOA statements and threatening letters. Word got around, Clement said quietly to Vernon. Turns out we weren't the only ones. Clement stood at the front of the room with his laptop open. I've reviewed statements from 37 households now. What I found is systematic overcharging on a scale that can only be described as fraud. The room went still. Clement continued. Ridgeline has been charging fees that aren't authorized in our CC&Rs. Violation fees for infractions that were never properly noticed. Administrative fees that compound monthly. I found charges for pool maintenance during months. The pool was closed. Landscaping invoices that don't match any work orders. Late fees applied retroactively to accounts that weren't late. How much? Vernon asked. Across the whole neighborhood? Clement looked at his notes. Based on the statements I've reviewed, Ridgeline has overcharged the homeowners of Pinewood Glen by approximately $400,000. $400,000. The number hung in the air like smoke. The room was silent for a long moment. Then Betty Waller started crying. Not loud, just quiet tears rolling down her cheeks. I almost lost my house last year, she said. My husband died in 2022. I was so confused by all the paperwork. They told me I owed $11,000. I didn't have it. I had to borrow from my sister just to stay in my home. Henry Yates spoke up from his chair in the corner. His voice was rough. They sent someone to my door, told me if I didn't pay, they put my house up for auction. I'm 83 years old. I served in Korea. And some kid in a polo shirt is telling me I'm going to be homeless. Vernon looked around the room. 17 people, 17 stories. All of them had been carrying this alone, thinking they were the only ones. Can we do anything? Betty asked, wiping her eyes. Legally? My daughter's friend is an attorney. Young guy, just started his own practice. He's hungry. I called him yesterday. He's willing to meet with us. Takes it on contingency, which means we don't pay unless we win. What about the HOA board? Vernon asked. The board's been rubber stamping whatever Ridgeline puts in front of them. Volunteer board, no financial experience, trusting the management company to do its job. They probably have no idea what's been happening. Then we need to tell them. We need to do more than tell them. Clement closed the laptop. We need to call an emergency meeting. Get this in front of the whole neighborhood. Put the board and Ridgeline on record. But first, we need someone to be the face of this. Someone the neighborhood knows. Someone they trust. 17 pairs of eyes turned toward Vernon. He wasn't a leader, never had been. He built birdhouses and kept to himself and tried not to bother anyone. But these people were in this room because of a conversation that started at his church. They were here because someone finally said out loud what everyone had been afraid to admit. "All right," Vernon said. "Tell me what I need to do." The emergency HOA meeting was scheduled for a Thursday evening at 7 o'clock. Normally, these meetings drew maybe 15 people. Vernon got there at 6:30, and the parking lot was already full. By 7 o'clock, there were over 100 homeowners packed into the community center. Folding chairs filled every inch of floor space. People stood along the walls. Some spilled out into the hallway. Vernon had never seen anything like it. The HOA board sat at a folding table at the front of the room. 5 volunteers who looked like they wanted to be anywhere else. Next to them sat a man Vernon didn't recognize, 40-something. Expensive suit, hair combed back with too much product, smile that didn't reach his eyes. "That's the Ridgeline rep," Clement whispered. "Mitchell Vance." The board president, Dale Worley, called the meeting to order and turned it over to Vernon. Vernon stood up. His knees ached. His heart was pounding, but his voice was steady. "My name is Vernon Slade. I've lived in Pinewood Glen for 24 years. Last month I received a foreclosure notice claiming I owe $18,000. He paused. "Let that sink in. I missed some payments last year during cancer treatment. About 8 months. That's $2,400. I sent them $6,000 to start catching up. They sent it back and told me they wanted everything or nothing." He looked around the room, at the faces of his neighbors, people he'd known for years, people he'd built birdhouses for. "I thought I was the only one. Turns out I wasn't even close." He gestured to Clement, who walked to the front with a stack of papers. "My name is Clement Howe. I'm a retired accountant. I've reviewed statements from 37 households in this neighborhood. What I found is systematic overcharging totaling approximately $400,000. Clement handed copies of his summary to each board member. "Ridgeline has been charging fees not authorized in our CC&Rs. I found charges for pool maintenance during months. The pool was closed. Landscaping invoices that don't match any work orders. Late fees applied retroactively to accounts that weren't late." The board members were reading now. Dale Worley's face had gone pale. Mitchell Vance stood up, still smiling. "These are serious allegations, and I understand emotions are running high, but I want to assure everyone that Ridgeline Property Services operates with full transparency." "Then explain the pool maintenance charges," Clement said. $3,200 for January and February. The pool was drained in December and didn't reopen until April. Vance's smile tightened. "There may have been a billing error." "A billing error?" Vernon stepped forward. "That's what you call it when you charge people for work you didn't do? Mr. Slade, these matters require proper review through appropriate channels. I tried appropriate channels. I sent you $6,000 and a letter explaining my situation. You sent it back with a form letter." Vernon pointed at the crowd. "Look at this room. How many of us are over 70? Over 80? How many are living on fixed incomes? You're not collecting debts. You're hunting." The room roared its agreement. One of the board members, Patricia Sims, spoke up. "We didn't know about any of this. They send us financial reports every month. Everything looked normal." "Because they're sending you summaries," Clement said, "not details. You've been approving invoices without seeing what's actually being charged." "We trusted them," Patricia said. "That's exactly what they were counting on." The crowd murmured its agreement. Vernon could feel the energy in the room shifting. These weren't just angry homeowners anymore. They were a community that had been wronged, and they knew it now. Vernon watched Vance's smile finally disappear. "We want a vote," Vernon said, "tonight, to terminate Ridgeline's contract." Vance stood up. "You can't do that. There's a termination clause. Penalties. You'll be in breach of contract. Then we'll be in breach of contract." Vernon turned to the board. "What's it going to be?" Someone in the back of the room shouted. "Vote them out." Others picked up the chant. Dale Worley banged on the table trying to restore order, but the crowd wasn't interested in order anymore. They wanted justice. Dale Worley looked at his fellow board members, then at the crowd, then at Vance. "All in favor of terminating the management contract with Ridgeline Property Services?" 5 hands went up. Motion passes. Unanimously, the room exploded into applause. Vance grabbed his laptop and walked out without another word. The door slammed behind him. Nobody watched him go. They were too busy celebrating. Dale Worley stood up and waited for the noise to die down. His face was pale. His hands were shaking. When he spoke, his voice cracked. "I'm also tendering my resignation from the board, effective tonight." "I think we all should." He looked at his fellow members. One by one, they nodded. "We failed you. We should have been paying closer attention. We're sorry." Vernon watched them gather their things and leave. The applause continued. People were hugging each other. Some were crying. Betty Waller was sitting in her chair with her hands over her face, shoulders shaking. Henry Yates had his cane raised in the air like a victory flag. Clement was shaking hands with the attorney, already talking about next steps. Depositions. Discovery. The state attorney general's office. Vernon just stood there, letting it sink in. For the first time since that envelope landed on his kitchen counter, Vernon Slade felt like he might actually win. 3 months later, Vernon pulled into his driveway and saw a crowd in his front yard. He thought something was wrong at first. Then he saw the balloons, the coolers, the folding tables covered with food, and in the corner of his backyard where the old rusted tool shed used to be, a brand new workshop, 10 feet by 12 feet, cedar siding, double doors, a window on each side. Clement walked over with a grin on his face. Surprise. "What is this? What does it look like?" "It's a workshop. The neighbors built it." Vernon looked around. There were at least 40 people in his yard, families he'd given birdhouses to over the years, men from the church breakfast. Betty Waller was arranging cookies on a table. Henry Yates was sitting in the shade with a glass of lemonade, his cane propped against his chair. "I don't understand," Vernon said. His voice was thick. "You spent 15 years building things for other people," Clement said. "Never asked for anything, never kept track." "But we kept track, Vernon. We all kept track, and we figured it was time to return the favor." Vernon walked over to the workshop and opened the doors. The smell of fresh cedar hit him first. Then he saw what was inside. A new workbench, solid and level. Pegboard walls with hooks for tools. Shelves lined with cedar planks and blocks of pine waiting to become something. A bandsaw in the corner that looked brand new. He ran his hand along the workbench, smooth, built by people who knew what they were doing. "Ray did the electrical," Clement said. "Eugene's grandson poured the foundation. Took us about 6 weeks to put it together." The past 3 months had been a whirlwind. The state attorney general opened an investigation into Ridgeline. 23 homeowners filed a class action lawsuit. The fraudulent fees were voided, the liens removed, the foreclosures dismissed. Ridgeline was barred from taking new contracts in the county pending the investigation. Their regional director, Mitchell Vance, was fired. Betty Waller got her $11,000 back. Henry Yates got a formal apology hand-delivered to his door. And Vernon Slade got to stay in the house where he'd spent 24 years with the woman he loved. A new HOA board was elected. They implemented new rules. 2 signatures required on every check. Monthly financial reports sent to all homeowners. No more management companies with the power to foreclose without board review. They asked Vernon to serve as president. He said no. Said he'd rather build birdhouses. He meant it. A boy appeared at Vernon's elbow, 8 or 9 years old, the grandson of someone on Maple Court. He was holding one of Vernon's birdhouses, examining it closely. "Did you really make this?" "I did. Can you teach me how?" Vernon looked at the workshop, at the new workbench and the fresh lumber and the bandsaw waiting to be used. Then he looked at the boy. "Come by next Saturday," Vernon said. "We'll start with something simple." The boy ran off to tell his family. Vernon watched him go. Clement walked over and stood beside him. Neither of them said anything for a moment. They just looked at the workshop, at the crowd in the yard, at the neighborhood that had come together when it mattered. "You know," Clement said, "when you spoke up at that breakfast, I almost didn't say anything. Almost kept my mouth shut like I'd been doing for weeks." "Why didn't you?" "Because you went first." Clement smiled. "Sometimes that's all it takes. One person willing to say what everyone else is thinking." Vernon thought about that, about the Sunday morning when he almost stayed home, about the weight he'd been carrying alone, about $18,000 in 30 days and a stack of mail he'd been too afraid to open. He thought about Doris, about what she would have said if she'd been here. Probably something about how he worried too much. Probably something about how things have a way of working out when you let people help. She would have been right. She usually was. Vernon looked at the workshop one more time. Then he walked over to the table where Betty Waller was arranging cookies, grabbed a plate, and sat down in the shade next to Henry Yates. 82 years old, Navy veteran, 31 years teaching shop class, 15 years building birdhouses, and apparently not done yet.